Happy Metroid Dread weekend, everybody. We've waited 19 years for this moment, and chances are, this is your first Metroid game. But what we all have in common this weekend is that this is our first time playing Metroid Dread, whether you are a new fan or old fan. So I've compiled a list of 10 tips to help you out while exploring the Planet ZDR. These range from exploration tips to combat tips, including combating the E.M.M.I. Because believe it or not, getting caught by one does not spell the end, because you can actually counter the E.M.M.I's attacks. Granted, it's really difficult to counter the E.M.M.I attacks because they're very unpredictable since the animations change when they're going to grab Samus or stab her in the neck. But you can counter the E.M.M.I's attack if you time it correctly by pressing the X button to counter them, which stuns them for about a few seconds, leaving you space for a clean getaway. This is indicated by the flashing red light, but the thing is, you have to counter it almost right before you even see it. So again, this is still difficult, but I found that the more you attempt this, the better you get at it. I'm already on my second run through of Metroid Dread, and I've gotten way better at this, so the key is to keep trying. However, it's better that you don't get caught by the E.M.M.I at all, and the best way to do this is by using the Phantom Cloak, which you acquire very early on in the game. While the Phantom Cloak is useful, it only works in dead ends where the E.M.M.I will stop and scan the area and turn around. If you're in a spot where the E.M.M.I can move forward, you will get caught as it moves forward. So the best way to hide from an E.M.M.I is after you get the Morph Ball, where you can use the Phantom Cloak inside little Morph Ball shafts, where the E.M.M.I will have quite a bit of trouble fitting in, so it'll be easier to hide from them. This is especially handy if you're on the run from an E.M.M.I and you need a quick spot to hide. So all you have to do is just slide down there into Morph Ball mode, turn on the Phantom Cloak, and you're safe. The next piece of advice I have for you is very familiar to Metroid fans, maybe not as much to new Metroid fans, and that is to farm items if you're low on health or ammunition. What do I mean by that exactly? Well, if you find a spot where fairly weak enemies are climbing out of holes and trying to attack you, you can just stand there and shoot them, causing them to drop ammo, health. It's very convenient, and this has been a method used since the very first Metroid game in 1986. And you know what they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But if you're looking for more items such as missile tanks and energy tanks, you're going to want to consult the map for this. And if you find a spot you're trying to go to, I definitely recommend using those map markers. This is a feature that was first introduced in Metroid Samus Returns, and I honestly didn't use it that much, but here in Metroid Dread it's quite useful because the markers will display on the minimap even if you're far away from them, and it makes it easier to follow the marker wherever you go just by following the arrow where the marker is pointing. And if you need the map to be bigger, you can hit left on the D-pad, which makes it bigger as long as you're standing still. It'll revert back to its original size when you start moving. Very convenient, very awesome. But what's not convenient are the icons that are on the map, because the map displays item icons whether you collect the item or not. It'll show you an item you've collected. It'll also show you an item you have yet to pick up. But the difference between the two is very minimal, because you would think that the items you've collected would appear faded. They are faded, just not very much, so it's really hard to tell the difference between the two. The way to remedy this is by clicking on an item and then hitting Y, which will highlight other items on the map that you have not collected yet in yellow, and the ones you have collected in gray. It makes it a touch easier, but this only goes for items you've encountered on screen, so not every item will display if you haven't been in the same vicinity as them. Luckily, the game has a feature where a segment of the map will blink a white light, which notifies you, hey, there's an item there, go find it. Sometimes it's really difficult to find this item, which is where the pulse radar comes in. This is an item you'll collect later, and it'll be very helpful in finding these items, as holding right on the D-pad will notify you of any blocks that are breakable, and chances are there's an item behind those blocks. But you don't get the pulse radar until much later, which kind of brings me to my next point. You really don't have to worry about backtracking when you start playing this game. Like, at all. For one, the game gets very restrictive after you collect certain items. Like when you go back to Artaria to collect the Varia suit, you might think, oh, I can now enter the hot areas in Artaria. Well, then the game blocks off a path. You can still go to Artaria the long way, but it gets pretty repetitive having to go back and forth between areas. So my advice to you is to just keep playing, just keep going on the game's designated path, because it'll take you in a full circle. You will eventually go back to Artaria and you can continue your 100% journey. Also, the teleportals, they only work 2 ways at first until you collect them all, and then you can just use all the teleportals in any direction you want. So again, my advice to you, don't worry about backtracking when you start, just keep playing, and then the world will open up to you and it'll make collecting the items just way easier. But let's talk about combat here. And we're not talking about combat with the E.M.M.I, we're talking about combat with these bosses. Metroid Dread has some extremely tough bosses. Even the first boss, Scorpius, can get really challenging. The best way to beat them is through trial and error. That being, you gotta learn these bosses' attack patterns, and once you learn them, you can beat them without getting hit once. It's still very challenging to not get hit once while battling a boss, but I found that the bosses I've struggled on got way easier the more I learned their attack patterns. So keep in mind that you might die the first time you encounter a boss, but it'll only get easier the more you die and learn their attack patterns. This also brings up the counter move. Never forget to counter, whether that's running counter, whether that's just standing still and waiting for your enemies to counter. However, the running counter is the most satisfying. It really brings the smackdown on the weaker enemies, and especially when they're about to attack, because countering even the toughest of foes can bring them down in seconds. And this also goes for the bosses, because if you don't counter their specific attacks, it will make their battles a lot longer and frankly a lot more frustrating. So keep countering in mind when you're battling these foes. But then, and this is the final tip, there are these Chozo bosses, and there are even these Chozo robot enemies that are extremely tough. They are without a doubt some of the toughest regular enemies I've ever seen in a Metroid game. The Chozo warrior bosses goes back to the point I made about memorizing patterns. Once you memorize the Chozo warriors patterns, it does get way easier to just take them down. But here, these Chozo robots, they're brutal. And the number one tip I have for you to take these guys down is to use flash shift. You might want to use flash shift to just get to point A to point B faster, but do not underestimate the power of flash shift in combat. It'll serve you well during these fights with bosses and enemies because they deal some very fast attacks that you're going to want to dodge right away. I'm not talking about just flashing away from them on the ground. I'm talking jump into the air, flash shift above them, get behind them, and pummel them with missiles. Flash shift is one of the most unique abilities in a Metroid game, and it really changes the flow of combat. And you know, it kind of makes the game feel like a 2D Platinum game. I'm not kidding. It's a very interesting attack that you definitely have to utilize if you want to beat Metroid Dread. But those are just 10 of my tips for beginners in Metroid Dread. And if you have any tips of your own, be sure to post them in the comment section below. And check out the videos on the right for more topics that you might be interested in, including my review of Metroid Dread. But until next time, everyone, buy Metroid Dread. You probably already bought Metroid Dread, but if you haven't, buy it.